Hello, I want to start off by thanking Floor & Decor for having me here today to talk to you about the topic, layers beneath the tile. My name is Matt. I live with my family in North Carolina. This is my 20th year in the tile industry. I started as a helper and worked hard to become an installer, business owner, and employer of several crews. I now work as a trainer for the National Tile Contractors Association. The NTCA is a nonprofit organization with a focus on training and educating tile contractors across the country. Let's take a look at our learning objectives that we will cover in the next little bit. Today we're going to learn the terminology and installation methods for a variety of backer board types. We're going to learn the installation of cementitious backer unit and fiber cement board in showers with a thick bed or a mortar bed pan. We're going to learn membrane types and proper applications of sheet and liquid waterproofing membranes. Let's start off by taking a look at backer boards. There are 6 different types of backer boards listed in the TCNA handbook. As we look at some of these details, you will notice that some of them have a designated ANSI standard and others have an ASTM standard. This is just the difference between how the manufacturer structures the testing for their product and which entity was used in the testing. When looking at a TCNA handbook detail, you'll find sections called recommended uses and another section called limitations for each category of backer board. When choosing a backer board for your project, you can generally find a TCNA handbook method that lists an ANSI test method or an ASTM standard, but it's also important to remember to check with your local building codes for approval of these specific backer boards in the application you're designing. Now, you've already heard me using a few different acronyms such as ANSI, ASTM, and the TCNA. The one I'm going to talk to you most about today is the TCNA. That stands for the Tile Council of North America. They produce a handbook every year, and the details and methods in that handbook are one of the things I'm going to share with you today. Although these TCNA methods have been tested, it is still a best practice with all tile setting materials to read the manufacturer's instructions before installation. Let's talk about cement backer units on the floor. The first thing I want to point out is that all of these methods that we're going to look at start with the letter F, which stands for floor, helping us easily identify the method. So let's get started. F146 utilizes coated glass matte water-resistant gypsum backer board. Man, that's a mouthful. That incorporates a moisture barrier on the face, which is designed to keep moisture from mitigating through the grout joint and potentially damaging the surface below. The board ends and edges are fit closely together, eliminating the gaps. We're going to tape the seams and corners with 2-inch alkaline-resistant glass fiber mesh tape and a cementitious bonding coat material such as thinset. Then you will notice that in this detail and all of the other floor details that we're going to look at, you'll notice the placement of a Portland cement mortar under the backer board to establish a supporting bed and eliminate voids, especially in the areas where subfloor may not be perfectly flat. Notice that each of the following details require the carpenter to provide the required gap between plywood subfloor panels. This expansion space is critical to floor performance. Also, pay particular attention to the maximum joist spacing, which is required by each type of backer board. F170 demonstrates the use of fiber-reinforced, water-resistant gypsum backer board. The details call for board to be installed with an 1/8-inch gap between sheets, which is filled with Portland cement mortar and taped with a 2-inch alkaline-resistant fiber mesh tape. We can move on to F175. Cementitious coated extruded foam backer board is slightly different in its installation. It requires that mortar be placed under the board to establish that supporting plane and eliminating voids. However, its ends and edges are fit tightly together and include the placement of a manufacturer's recommended sealant or banding in the panel's joints as they are installed, and as well as over top of the fasteners, the heads of the fastener penetrations. Here we see F144. This method, which incorporates the installation detail for both cement backer board and fiber cement board. These two boards are grouped together not because they are in the same category, but rather that they share the same installation procedures. Let's take a look at F144 from a more hands-on perspective. So I've already started working on this module, and this is an example of F144. We're going to be installing a fiber cement backer unit, but there's a couple things that I'd like to point out to you here. We've got a wooden subfloor. Our joists are 16 on center, and we also want to look at any holes or divots that might be in this subfloor, and we want to fix those before we start installing any kind of backer board. Another thing that we want to look at, and I want to point out, is we've got our gap in our plywood right here. Our carpenters put this in here for us. They've got about 1/8 of an inch, and that's going to allow that proper movement of the subfloor, that expansion and contraction that's required in the subfloor. So we've honored that, and we've also taken this joint in the plywood in the panels here. We've taken that into consideration when we started laying out our backer board. And so I did not start a sheet of the backer board in line with the joint on the subfloor. And so that's, you always want to stagger your joints when installing backer board over top of a plywood or any kind of subfloor like this. So then the next thing we have to always take into consideration is this is not ready to go. We've got dirt, we've got dust on here, and so we would always need to wipe this down. We're doing a couple different things as we do this. One, we're cleaning it, we're getting the dust off of it, we're taking away any kind of bond breakers. But we're also doing something else as we do this. I'm not putting a ton of water on the floor, but I'm giving this dry substrate here, this plywood, I'm giving it a drink of water. And that's going to allow my thin set not to dry out. It's not going to suck the moisture out of my thin set when I apply it here. So I'm wiping this down, getting the dust off, but I'm also giving this plywood subfloor a drink. We've still got one problem that I'm not going to be able to fix today because I don't have all my tools with me, but we've got paint here on the floor. Came like this from the box store. And you know, we would want to address this. We've all seen on jobs, whether it's new construction or renovation, that paint overspray, the painter will always leave us, 6 inches around the perimeter. We always want to address that. We want to take a belt sander and we want to sand that off. Speaking of belt sanders, here's one other thing. I already mentioned this joint right here, but what if those joints had seen some weather before the roof went on the house? And what if those joints had kind of tented up a little bit? What if we had a hump right here in the joints of the two pieces of plywood? Well, we would want to address that and we would want to fix that before we start installing any backer board. So again, we could take a belt sander, some 40 grit sandpaper, and we could flatten that subfloor out just a little bit. So we flattened our floor, we've added any patch that we needed to add, we've wiped down any of the dust, we've removed the dust, we've given our plywood subfloor a drink of water, we've hydrated it. We are now ready to add some thin set. So let's put some thin set, and we don't want to just put thin set on there and then just start troweling with our ridges. We don't want to just go straight to that motion. We want to always use the flat side of our trowel first. And what we're doing is burning in or keying in our mortar. So always really important to do this, both with installing backer board, but also with installing tile. Using the flat side of our trowel, we're burning this in. And what that's doing is it's just pushing that thin set. We're keying in and we're creating a nice, good bond to our plywood, and we're filling in any little holes and any little gaps. So now that we've got that keyed in, now we can use the ridged side of our trowel. can comb this out. Now we've got a nice even bed of mortar here, and this is really critical. All of the backer boards that we're talking about today require this bed of mortar here. And again, I'm going to just emphasize that this is not so much to bond the backer board to the substrate, but it's more of a bedding so that if there is any variation, there won't be a hollow spot in the backer board. So we're filling any voids by doing this. And then we're ready to go ahead and set this in here. Now, as I put this on here, or put this down, if we look back at F144, and that tells us all about fiber cement board, it tells us that we need this 1/8 inch gap right here. So I'm going to space this out at about an 1/8 inch. You could use a nail on each end as a spacer. But there we go. Now I'm ready to fasten this to the subfloor. If we read the manufacturer's directions, we could use screws, we could use nails, and that will vary just a little bit depending on the manufacturer. So always good to check which fastener the manufacturer approves. So let's go ahead and we'll nail this off. So you'll notice as I'm nailing this particular manufacturer makes it really easy on me, and there's these little, they've laid out our nailing pattern by giving us these little indentations in the board, telling me exactly where our fasteners need to go. And so I don't have to guess at our nailing pattern. But if we were to go back and read the directions of all the different manufacturers, most of them are going to recommend a maximum of 8 inches between fasteners. I think that's all of the fasteners. So we are now ready to go ahead and we'll tape this off. So I'm going to, again, use the flat side of my trowel. Very important to remember to use an alkaline resistant tape. What does that mean? Alkaline is a chemical in the thin set, and we want to use an alkaline resistant tape, because if we were to just use a drywall mesh tape or something along those lines, the chemicals in the thin set will actually eat through it over time. So we always want to use an alkaline resistant mesh tape. And that's it. So now this is ready to go. We could let this dry and we are ready to go on that. As we learned earlier, TCNA handbook method starting with F stands for floor. So you won't be surprised to hear that as we move into the walls, those details start with W. Let's get into more specific details about cement backer units as we look at some wall details. W245. The coated glass matte water-resistant gypsum backer board is installed with its ends and edges, including corners, fit tightly together so as to eliminate gaps between the sheets. We're going to tape the seams using a 2-inch alkaline resistant glass fiber mesh tape and a cementitious bonding material, just like we did on the floor. And then we're going to skin coat over the fastener heads, unless waterproofing has been applied. W245 may be used in areas where the temperature will not exceed 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Moving on to W247, fiber reinforced, water resistant gypsum backer board installs the same way as cement board and fiber cement board, which we'll take a look at in just a minute. But it is not for use in areas exposed to temperatures exceeding 125 degrees Fahrenheit. W248 glass mat water resistant gypsum backer board is installed with its ends and edges fit closely together to eliminate gaps between the sheets, including inside corners. We're going to tape the seams and corners with 2-inch alkaline resistant fiberglass tape and cementitious bonding material. Again, the same as what we just did. This board is limited to dry areas where the temperature does not exceed 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Cementitious coated extruded foam backer board is installed fitting ends and edges tightly together, including inside corners. Apply a bead of the manufacturer's recommended sealant in the panel joints as the panels are being installed, and over fastener heads and washers per their recommendations. Also, some manufacturers may also want us to put instead of the sealant, put a piece of banding over top. If it's not in a wet area, the joints can also be taped with a 2-inch alkaline resistant fiber tape and the cementitious bonding material. So you might ask, well, you said that this is a cementitious foam board. Does that mean that all foam boards fall under this category? The answer is no. So we have other foam boards such as this right here that most of us are going to be familiar with. This board that we see here and other foam boards do not actually have a TCNA method designated for them. What makes this board different that we've talked about already is that it has that cementitious coating on the face of it. So that's what differentiates that board versus this board. Now let's take a look at cement backer board. This will fall under W244C. So they add the C on the end and that stands for cement. It should have an 1/8 inch horizontal space between the sheets that is filled with a latex Portland cement mortar and taped with a 2-inch alkaline resistant fiberglass mesh tape. Vertical spaces should be similarly filled and taped. At inside corners, we want to allow for an expansion, the space between the sheets on an adjacent wall. Tape the joints with a skim coat of latex Portland cement mortar, but do not allow the mortar to fill the open space between the backer board sheets. This board may be used in areas exposed to temperatures exceeding 125 degrees Fahrenheit. This is also important. This board may also be installed on exterior surfaces under method W244E, E for exterior. It is the only backer board in the group we are reviewing today which may be used outside. Let's move on to W244F, which is going to look very similar to the previous one. The fiber cement board, backer board is very similar to W244C, the cement board, and it installs the same fashion, including use in areas exceeding 125 degrees Fahrenheit. It is given its own installation detail to differentiate it from cement board since it is a different composition. We will see how the cement board and fiber cement board are handled differently when we look at shower installations. Let's take a look at that now. So this is our shower module that we're going to work on today. This would be an example of what we would call a B415 shower module. What makes it a B415 is we have our mud bed and we're using a PVC rubber liner here. You can see an example of that on your screen. So both the fiber cement board and the cement board would fall into this B415 module, but they install differently. So that's what I want to take a look at right now. So we're going to start with the method of W244C, which is for the cement board. So let's go ahead and start getting that installed right now. So one of the first things that I'm going to point out is that in the detail, it tells us not to have this pushed up tight to the framing. We always want to have that expansion and contraction. So we're going to leave that a little bit of a gap right here in this corner. And now we're ready to start screwing this off. We're going to again use an 8-inch nailing pattern. And before we do that, I should put these on. So now we're going to use an 8-inch nailing pattern. And because this is a shower, we want to be cautious of how low we put our screws. We have our shower pan liner coming up here. Well, if we were to read into that detail, it says no fasteners 3 inches above or no lower than 3 inches above our curb. Well, we have an imaginary curb today, so I'm going to put a screw right here, and that's going to be our imaginary 3 inches. And again, I'm going about every 8 inches. I'm going to come over here and get this side as well. Now we also, if we were to look at that detail with a fiber or with a cement board, we need a gap right here in between our boards. So a good way to do that is we can just temporarily put a screw right here, another screw on the other side. And so before we put our next sheet up, that's going to hold us approximately an 1/8 inch with that gap right there. I did get a little bit ahead of myself though. I do want to mention one other thing. Before we start putting in our cement board, we want to check and see if our walls are flat. That would be a great place to start, wouldn't it? So we would put a straight edge on here. If we need to fix any framing, use any shims or anything like that, we would do that before we started putting any cement board on there. So let's go ahead and get that last piece up there. So that will hold. We can now pull these screws out, use them somewhere else. Again, I'm maintaining that expansion gap in my corner right here. I've still got enough for an expansion joint. Very good. All right, if you guys will follow me over here, we got to grab our thin set. We are ready to apply that. We're ready for some mesh tape over here. So I can pre-cut this mesh tape to length. I'm just going to set that aside for a minute. Very good, that's ready to go. That is an example of W244C. So now let's take a look at a fiber cement board, and we're gonna actually cut a piece to put on this wall. So I've already measured and we've got 36 inches. And so I'm going to mark, and I'm just using a scoring tool. So this is a scoring tool for cutting cement board. Dust free. That's one of the great benefits, and it's got a sharp tip on it, but it will not cut you. It's not a razor knife. So safe, and effectively it's dust free. So let's line this up. So we've got this cut, we're ready to install it. Let's bring it over here. And this is the biggest thing. These are the two biggest differences between the cement board and the fiber board. Here it is, and I'm gonna put the detail back on the screen as well. The cement board is able to go down into the mud bed. The fiber board cannot go into the mud bed. It has to be shimmed up so that water does not wick up into the fiber cement board. So I'm gonna just take some horseshoe spacers and I'm gonna shim this up on each side 1/4 inch. So that's really the biggest difference, and you'll notice that on the screen. We want shims on the fiber rock, and on the Durarock, it can get, or on the cement board, it can get buried into the mud. The fiber board, it has to be shimmed up above it. So let's get some screws in here to hold this. All right. So if you were to look into that corner, you'll notice that that cavity in that corner right there, there's a gap in there. So when we go to tape that joint right there, we don't want to fill that gap with any kind of mortar. We want to leave that clean. So it takes a little bit of extra care and caution when doing a corner like this. But let's get this ready to go, and I'll put that right there. And then let's tape this corner together. So I'm using the flat side of my trowel, but you'll notice that I'm taking caution when I do that not to let mortar go into that cavity. And in doing this, we're going to allow this wall to move independently of this wall. If we were to fill that gap with mortar, and we're going to lock those two together, and that's where we're going to start to have issues as we start to see expansion and contraction over time, we want to let those walls move independently of each other. There we go, a little bit of touch up and that will be ready to go. Now if we were going to continue installing fiber rock on this wall, we would do the exact same thing as we did over here. I would place a couple of screws as spacers, and then I would put my next board on top of that, leaving that gap. Exact same way I did this wall over here. So let's move on to talking about membranes. The TCA handbook has 171 details. 35 details do not include membranes, 48 require membranes, and 88 details list membranes as an option. So why would we want to add a membrane? Well, we have positive waterproofing, water management, we have crack isolation, we have reduced moisture vapor transmission, sound attenuation, which means the reduction in the strength of a signal, improved warranties from the manufacturer. So you can see in the photo on the left evidence of incorrect slope. Improper installation of membranes can result in costly failures. When we think about water damage, we often think about natural disasters that make the headlines, such as hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, or wildfires. But the humble water leak results in approximately 24% of property loss, equaling millions and millions of dollars. So let's take a look at how to properly install a few commonly used membranes. So we're going to start with liquid membranes, and we're going to go back over to our floor module, and we're going to work right there. So before we started today, I've already done one step that's really important, but I've already taken the lid off of this. And anytime we're using a liquid waterproofing membrane, we want to stir that. If it sits on a shelf for a while, some of that slurry, more of a water consistency can come to the top. So we want to give that a good stir, make sure it's consistent. And then let's talk about what we need to do next. The same as we did with our wooden subfloor, we would need to get the dust off of this. So nothing's going to stick to dust. So we want to give this a good wipe down. And again, we're dealing with a very dry, thirsty material. So we're applying a little bit of moisture to this board, helping it to hydrate itself, or we're hydrating it as before we apply our liquid waterproofing membrane. So I'm just going to simply dump a little bit of this out, and then let's talk about how to apply this. We have a couple different options. We could simply use a roller, and we could move this around. I'm just going to work this for a second. I'm going to push some of the extra to the front. We could use a small roller for some tighter areas. But as I start to work this, if we can get a close-up right here, I want to point out something. What you'll see the roller will do, and I'm going to do another small section right here with the paintbrush. What you'll notice with both of these, as we apply this, we're going to have some thicker areas right here, but then we're also going to have some real thin areas here. We're going to have some lines that the roller leaves behind. As we're rolling back and forth, it will leave some of those lines from the roller. And the whole key is to get a consistency across this. Now, before we ever start, what we should do is pull this right here. This is the installation instructions that comes with this, and you'll notice that this is on the top of all the different buckets of waterproofing that we have. But if we open this, it tells us exactly how thick to apply this. And so what we're looking for with this product in particular is 20 mils, and that's we want that to be 20 mils as it's wet. It will actually shrink a little bit as it dries. And so how do we know if we have 20 mils? Well, that's where this tool comes in, and this is a wet film thickness gauge. And it's got little grooves, little teeth on it right here. And so again, I don't have a good consistent base right here, so we have to fix that first. And then once we get that fixed, we're shooting for 20 mils, which will be right here, and I'll show you how to use this tool in just a second. So we could maybe start and spread out our material like this, but it's not a good way to get consistency. So I'm actually going to take a small trowel and we're going to comb this out. Well, now you can see I have consistency, but that's obviously not waterproof. It's not a crack isolation membrane because we have all of those grooves in there. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take the flat side of my trowel here and I'm going to get just a little bit of membrane on the edge of it, and then we're going to start over on this side and we're going to comb that over. So the reason I put a little bit of extra material on the flat side of my trowel is so that as I'm flattening this out, I'm not actually taking any material away. So I'm not adding any material, I'm not taking away any material. So as you can see, when I do this, I've now got a much more consistent area covered, but it requires more than one coat. And so you'll notice that I have a couple of bare spots, and that will fill in as we add more material. So let's take a look and see how I'm doing on our thickness. So again, I've read the instructions and we are looking for 20 mils as it is wet. And I'm going to use my wet film thickness gauge, and I'm simply going to take this and I'm going to push it with the 20 side down. I'm going to go straight down into this material. I'm going to lift it straight up, and then I'm going to bring it over to this piece of paper and I'm going to go straight down. And then I'm going to move it back just a little bit. And it's going to be really hard to see on camera here, but this actually says that I have 26 mils. So I have too much material. So what that means is I've got to either adjust how I'm using my trowel, or I need to get a whole new trowel altogether. So let's try this one more time. Let's see if I can adjust this and get our 20 mils. And that did it. We've got right at 20, almost 22, but 20 is what we're shooting for, and the instructions actually say approximately 20. So we're shooting for 20, we got 22, so we're much closer. If I had a big area to do, we may want to play with the type of trowel we're using. We may want a different notch for this material, and all of these products have a different thickness that they need to be applied. So play with a small area, get the proper amount of coverage that you need, and that is a great way to get this material applied evenly. Let's walk back over to our other module, which again is a B415, and talk about some other waterproofing options. If we were to open up our TCA manual again to B415, you'll see that there are different environmental exposure classifications. Well, what that means is we have to determine how much water our shower is going to see, or our walls are going to see. Whatever we're building, it's going to fall within one of those classifications. So I left this board off so that you could see I've got this vapor retarder right here, and this is just a 6 mil plastic, but this is behind our fiber cement board. So that's one option, and that would fall under one of the classifications of the environmental exposure. Another option would be to put a membrane on this wall. And we're going to go ahead and do that now. And so this is the membrane right here that we're going to use. And so let's get started on that. Very first thing we need to do, let's get the stickers out of the way. That one's on there good. There we go. All right, next thing, we've got to get that dust off of there. So let's wipe this down. And again, it's a thirsty substrate, so we're also giving it a drink as we're removing any dust. We're ready to go there. So I'm going to apply a little bit of mortar to my substrate, and then once again we're going to use that flat side of the trowel, and we're going to key in this mortar. I've got that keyed in. We're going to apply some more mortar. All right, we're ready for our first piece of membrane. I'm just going to align this with the bottom. I've got it up there. I'm going to actually take a sponge and clean this trowel off. Something else that works great for what I'm getting ready to do would be a broad knife or a flat trowel, a drywall trowel, something along those lines. But today we're just going to use the flat side of our trowel. So my goal in this is you'll see that I'm starting from the middle and I'm pulling up and I'm pushing all that air out from behind the membrane, causing a really good strong bond. And always the best practice just to double check and make sure. Let's peel that back and we've got really good bond in there. So that looks good. I'm happy with that. So that looks good there. Let's do the exact same thing here on the floor. We've got a little bit of dust on the floor. So let's get rid of this dust and dirt. At the same time, we're giving our thirsty substrate a drink. And it's the exact same process all over again. I'm going to apply mortar, then use the flat side of my trowel. And then we're going to use the ridges of the trowel and comb this out. little bit shy there. Use the flat side of our trowel to smooth it out, work out any air pockets in there. That feels good. Let's double check this for coverage one last time. That looks good there. Very good. So we've got two pieces of membrane, one on the wall, one on the floor. Problem is we still have this cavity right here. We've got this joint. We would need to put a piece of banding right there. So exact same thing. I'm going to use the flat side of my trowel and burn this in. Now I don't need to wet this because it's a waterproof membrane, so it's not thirsty. It's the water's just going to puddle on the top of it. So I don't need to wet that down. It's a brand new roll, so it's not dirty, it's not dusty. I just unpacked it. We've got that burned in. Now, one thing you'll notice with this piece of banding, I've already cut it to fit, but not only have I cut it to fit, I've actually folded it in half too, and I've kind of worked that crease into it, so it's already kind of got that crease. And that will make life a lot easier to help install this. So I'm just going to find that crease and I'm going to push it down into that corner, and I'm just going to work my way across there. This time I'm just using a margin trowel, the flat side of my margin trowel, flat edge of the margin trowel, and I'm removing any air pockets, embedding that piece of banding to the membrane. So there we go, there's some membrane installed on the wall. So this is one option, again, membrane over top of a cement board. This is gonna fall under one environmental classification. And over here behind the fiber rock, we have that 6 mil plastic, which is a vapor retarder, and that's gonna fall under a environmental classification as well. So point is, you need to know what environmental classification you're gonna fall into as you're building a shower, or you're going into a dry area. Where are you installing tile? What is the purpose of that environment? And how is it going to be used? So important to know all of those things. So let's wrap up with a summary of what we've talked about today. We've learned terminology and installation methods for a variety of backer board types. We've learned proper installation of cementitious backer units, or CBU, on the floor. We've learned proper installation of cementitious backer units and fiber cement board in a shower with a thick bed or mortar bed pan. And we've learned membrane types and proper applications of sheet and liquid waterproofing membranes. So that's it for me today. Again, I'm Matt with the NTCA, and I want to thank you for joining us for this webinar, and a big thank you to Floor & Decor for having us here today.